Okay, our second little video on this week's, or I should say the third week's readings, and now we arrive at a critical problem for your essays, for the second component of the essay, the problem of um, partiality, the problem of factionalism. This all goes to the sort of perversion of the spectator. And I mean, it is super interesting, right? The way that Smith will talk about the problem of the witness, the problem of giving testimony. Because if you think about like what's maybe one of the absolute worst things you could ever do, well, it's bear false witness. Right? I mean, that's condemned in the Bible, but you just know, right, when someone's falsely accused you of something, right? It's absolutely enraging, and perhaps some of you have guilt over having borne false witness against someone else, right? So it's definitely like one of the absolute worst things, and the problem is that this bearing of false witness can happen. It can happen in individual lives, but it can happen at the level of entire societies, right? So you think about the problem of propaganda, the problem of ideology. Think about even just lawyers when they do voir dire. You know, that's when they pick the jury at a trial, right? What they try to do is pick jurors. I mean, the jurors have to swear independence, right? You can't meddle with a jury. That's a crime to meddle with a jury. And the jury has to swear a certain kind of independence. But the lawyers kind of try to if exclude people with bias, but also maybe people who might sort of favor where they're coming from, right, in their cases. So this problem of faction goes to the problem about the man without and the man within, which one has precedence. Now, structurally or formally, the way it's set up, the man within, right? But Smith says that the impartial spectator is a demigod. It's such a cool idea. And the problem of the demigod is that the man without, this is that kind of flesh and blood spectator, right? The people that you and I interact with, that spectator can easily fall into faction, can easily become biased, can easily, he says at one point, right, it's very hard, he says, to resist a general contagion, right? So think about like on social media, maybe on TikTok or X or whatever, right? A kind of like a cascade or a storm, right? Where a certain opinion or a certain belief gets momentum, and it might be completely false, but it barely matters, right? It could completely ruin someone's life, even if they've been misunderstood or even falsely accused, right? It barely matters, right? So that's what Smith says, right? He says that the man within, this absolutely essential moral principle, right, that keeps you and I proportionate, well, what happens when we become disproportionate to the man without, the flesh and blood spectator? So Smith at one point talks about he uses the idea of man, of course, right, but the person of candor, right? The person who, he says, the person of candor, when their nation is all riled up with animosity, is of course reviled, is hated. Even though they're a person of candor, that is to say, right, they are the impartial spectator. They are the man within. They are being true to that, right? Remember what we said in the previous video, or what's in the Smith text, right? This natural sense, right? This natural sense of what is praiseworthy and blameworthy. So what Smith does, right, he talks about the problem of war, and then he talks about the problem of civil war. Now, war's bad enough, right? Because he says in war, even a principle that all of us should totally recognize and affirm the idea that women and children, the innocent, I mean, sometimes women fight, right? But in modern armies, women fight, right? At least some, but for the most part, right? The old idea, right, was that the innocent, the elderly, typically women, children, should not be hurt. And he says, well, in war, that's often not the case, and the reason is that the impartial spectator that would insist on that principle that the innocent not be killed gets clouded out, right, by the clamor, by the aggression of the partisanship that kind of stirs up all of these sort of malevolent sentiments. So the readings raise this really complicated and desperate problem, right? What happens when the spectator, the impartial spectator in particular, when the impartial spectator is, as he puts it, placed at a distance, when it can't get a purchase, when it can't be, right, there's this real sense, right, that the spectator is sort of watching, right? So when the spectator isn't allowed to watch, right? So think about, why is it that most crime happens at night? Because it's dark, the spectator can't see. What happens when a country doesn't permit foreign journalists to come in and see what's going on, right? Well, what the country's doing, right, it's hiding. It's hiding what it's doing, right? It doesn't want what it's doing to be brought to the light of the spectator, right? So to keep the spectator at bay. Now, Smith, in his economic writings, talks about something called the conspiracy of the merchants. It's actually very interesting. He contrasts, now this is not in our book, right? This is in The Wealth of Nations, but he contrasts farmers who basically always work in the public, outside, in the open, and merchants, right, who often work in rooms behind closed doors. And so he comes up with this phrase, the conspiracy of the merchants, that whenever you have secret societies, right, places, peoples, countries where the spectator, the impartial spectator, cannot watch, then those secret societies tend to become malevolent. Why? Well, because all morality is downstream of this spectator idea, right? Being sort of watched, right? So what happens is that people become sort of furtive, and that's when the immoralities happen. So our last readings are all about this phenomenon of what you might call the human proclivity to tribalism. You know, this is why a lot of companies have rules about this, right? To maintain company solidarity, right? They prohibit what they call sometimes background conversations. That's when certain people, maybe on the shop floor or in office, they start talking to one another about somebody else, right? Or about management or something like that, right? So these background conversations, you know, are frowned upon, because they stir up this partisanship, and that can then lead to kind of schism. It can lead to this sort of break in the social fabric. And of course, what Smith's all about, right? We know this, right? It's all about harmony. It's all about symmetry, because morality, right, is about retaining that proportion between your desires and the desires of those around you. Okay? All right, so hopefully that's given you a few pointers about the last readings, and good luck with those. And I think you'll see, you know, the reason I assigned those readings is obviously it goes to the heart of our final part 2 of the essays you've got to write. Okay, bye-bye.